Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 293. This week the questions are taken from guides 368 and 369, that's the guide to the Seydlitz-Weser and PT boats of World War II, along with the Wednesday videos on Albany? Oh, I can't remember which one. Anyway, Australia, I think it's Albany, and the two-part video on Operation C, both what actually happened and what could have happened. So let's get on with questions. PK Zhang asks, between the Matsushimas, Kitakami, Shimakaze, the Tones, the refit Fusos and the refit Ises, which was the worst of the Imperial Japanese Navy's what the heck designs? For me personally, it's got to be the Matsushimas, because I can kind of see the logic behind all of the others. It may not necessarily be very good logic, but there is, a degree of reasoning to it. So, with the Kitakami, refit, and Shimakaze, we know the Japanese have long-range, long-lance torpedoes. We know they're trying to exploit that by carrying as many into battle as possible. We know what their battle doctrine says about how they should be used. So, within that context, having a few ships that can lob ridiculous numbers of torpedoes, especially at night, makes a certain degree of sense. They obviously never got to quite use the ships in the way they intended, but that's not really their fault. Well, it's kind of their fault for starting the Pacific War in the first place, but the specific tactical doctrines that they were designed for never came up, largely because the Americans refused to play ball. The Tones, they're still serviceable heavy cruisers. I mean, the idea of having a cruiser that also does a lot of aerial recon wasn't entirely foreign to various powers. The fact that Tones kind of went a little bit more down that road, well, they're not bad ships for it. Yes, you could have done something slightly different. They do look a little bit unusual, but there is a reason for them. The refit Fusos, I mean, they're making the best of the fact they have some old 14-inch ships. The fact they have hilariously tall pagoda structures is, again, just a matter of how the Japanese thought they were going to be building superstructures. The refit Ises are a little bit harder to justify. I've said before, I've kind of have my Ise tactical doctrine in that, in theory, a battle carrier, not necessarily exactly the way they implemented the Ise conversions, but a battle carrier, in principle, does have a certain degree of utility in very specific circumstances. The problem is if you're in those very specific circumstances where they might be of marginal help, you have much bigger problems than are ever going to be solved by having a battle carrier. So, yeah. But, they were still capable of fighting, and unlike some battle carrier designs, they at least had the good sense to stick all the aviation stuff aft, where, okay, yes, it could still be set on fire, but that would be slightly less critical than a battle carrier design where all the aircraft facilities are amidships, and, well, fires amidships in the vicinity of your machinery plant don't tend to work very well for anybody, well, except your enemies, because they'll be very happy about it. The Matsushimas, however, there's a very loose logic to being able to be in multiple places at once with what should have been a class of 4. They ended up only building 3. But the idea of forming this kind of Voltron conga line of extremely poorly protected cruisers that somehow would then have the firepower of a pre-Dreadnought is extremely flawed. Apart from the fact that they very little protection, so they're in a real battle line engagement, they're going to get knocked out very, very quickly. Also, the idea of putting a socking great battleship grade gun on a relatively small cruiser hull is one of those things that looks great on paper, but probably falls apart the moment you start trying to actually think about it in practical terms. And indeed, that is what happened in terms of being able to aim the thing, reload the thing. It was just too much gun for the ship. Now, yes, you could get this kind of gun or larger on even smaller hulls for things like monitors, but the monitor's hull form is a very, very different thing to a Matsushima type cruiser. It's much more stable for one thing, and it's pretty much, when you're talking about monitors, purely dedicated to the firing of the big guns, whereas the Matsushimas also had to move relatively quickly and had a fairly extensive secondary battery. So, yeah, the Matsushimas, I think, for me, are the worst of them, because really kind of any sensible second opinion, or even sitting down to think about it for more than 2 seconds, would have told them it was a terrible idea. Plus, of course, even if there was a marginal benefit in this kind of, by our powers combined sort of formation pre-Dreadnought, the fact you then go and cancel one of them means that even that questionable utility is somewhat robbed. Anti-Logicality asks, throughout the Second World War, Germany managed to capture a variety of foreign ships and put them into frontline service, such as the Belgian Artevelde, the Greek Vasilyevs Georgios, the Dutch Gerard Kallenberg, the Yugoslav Beograd, the Italian Antonio Pigafetta, amongst many others. I noticed, however, the Germans never put any Soviet ships into service, despite capturing several major Soviet ports. Why is this? Well, the Germans did manage to capture quite a number of Soviet ships, but the vast majority of them were merchant ships, and they did put those into service. They also captured a number of what you would call auxiliary Soviet warships, so things like tugs, tankers, 1 or 2 transports, a couple of icebreakers, that kind of thing. And some of those were also pressed into service, although some of them were also just not in a fit state to be used. And they did also capture 1 or 2 very small warships, so a couple of little river monitors like this one, not this one specifically, but this type where you've got the little T-34 tank turret on it, and a couple of MTBs, that kind of thing. So very small warships, and again, some of those were repurposed. But when you look at the other nations that you listed, the big difference is that whilst obviously each of those nations did fall under German control, or in the case of the Italians, they kind of just took control of the bit they were already present in when the Italian armistice was signed, each of those other nations had been defeated and in many cases overrun by the Germans in war, but portions of that nation's navy were still intact, and the Germans just decided that in the peace treaty they were going to get hold of some of those vessels. Whereas when you look at, obviously, the war with the Soviet Union, the Germans never managed to defeat the Soviet Union, so they weren't able to force the Soviet Union to sign a treaty that said, these ships that we happen to still have can now go into Kriegsmarine service. And because it was an ongoing war, it meant that whilst they did capture a number of Soviet ports, the Soviets were usually pretty good at either withdrawing their ships from those ports before the port fell, because usually something as major as a port doesn't fall dramatically fast in terms of not being able to get ships out of there. And if there were ships that couldn't get out of there due to damage or lack of fuel or lack of crews or whatever, the Soviets were, again, usually fairly good at scuttling them and taking a ship that just happens to be in a port and going, right, this is now under the Kriegsmarine ensign, is a very different and much easier operation to, we now have to salvage this thing and repair it, obviously with technology and systems that aren't compatible with German systems they might have to hand, and then put it into service. That kind of thing would usually be far too much effort for the Germans to go through in the middle of a major war. And of course, because it was an ongoing war, various organizations like the Luftwaffe had usually had a say in things as well, bombing Soviet ships and sinking them, which, again, salvage and repair being quite difficult. So essentially what it comes down to is, yes, some small and auxiliary vessels were captured and put into service, but not a lot of large Soviet vessels fell into German hands in the first place, and the ones that did either were incomplete, like one of the Sovietsky Soyuzes, or were so badly damaged and or sunk that it just wasn't worth returning them into service. Next up we have, assuming that the Imperial Japanese Navy builds another 2 Shokakus instead of the Yamatos, accounting for the fact they can't really build more than this anyway due to their infrastructure and time limitations, how much longer would the Imperial Japanese Navy carrier arm survive before being overrun by the Essex Swarm, assuming that the not Yamato Shokakus managed to enter service with pilots, but apart from this, overall Japanese pilot training doctrine otherwise remains the same as historically? It's a difficult one to answer because, in theory, they could last an awful lot longer, but the problem is that assumes that everything stays the same on the US side rather than, operational plans changing. Because if you look at the build time for Shokaku and Zuikaku, average it out, and then overlay that on the laydown dates for Yamato and Musashi, it works out that you could probably get the theoretical 3rd and 4th Shokakus in service before Japan enters the Second World War. Now, that poses a few problems for our theoretical timeline, because that means that instead of having Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku going to Pearl Harbor, i.e. 6 carriers, you're increasing that carrier strike force by a third, because, at least in theory, the 3rd and 4th Shokakus would be ready and able to head out. Their commissioning time would be not dissimilar to the original 2. That means that Pearl Harbor gets hit by considerably more aircraft. Now, that doesn't affect the US carrier fleet directly, because they're just physically not there, but what else gets hit? Who knows? Now, that's the least of our concerns. The bigger concern at that point is that when you have the subsequent Japanese carrier forces going out and doing various things, in theory, you could deploy all 4 Shokakus to the Battle of Coral Sea. That would probably mean that the Battle of Coral Sea goes very badly for the Americans. I mean, historically, they lose Lexington and get Yorktown damaged. If they've got 2 additional large fleet carriers worth of aircraft to throw at the problem, the chances are the damage to Yorktown probably becomes fatal damage to Yorktown, at which point the Americans have lost their carrier force that they've dispatched to stop the Japanese, at which point the Japanese invasion convoy, which historically was turned back, in part thanks to the loss of Shoho, probably isn't going to turn back, which, that's already changing the way that the Second World War pans out in 1942 quite considerably. But then the thing is, if the Japanese are sending 4 Shokaku class, and the Americans know this, which is relatively likely, would the Americans send 2 carriers up against 4? Probably not. So the Battle of Coral Sea would probably play out very differently. But even if we assume that for whatever reason the Battle of Coral Sea plays out as it does historically, and they don't send these other 2 Shokakus down there for whatever reason, well, then you have the Battle of Midway. And then at Midway, you had, historically Shokaku and Zuikaku were not there, but now the other 2 Shokakus are potentially at Midway, and this runs us into some fairly big problems because, of course, Yorktown is lost at Midway, historically, thanks to the counterstrike by Hiryu, and the Americans somewhat get away with that thanks to the fact that obviously their own strike forces have crippled Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga. So the Japanese are limited in what forces they can send as a counterattack force. Now, if you've got 2 full-size Shokakus there, that is a lot more aircraft coming in to counterattack. Now, of course, Hornets aircraft go off and get lost, and there's every possibility that, the Japanese aircraft, even if they don't get lost, because the American carriers are each operating independently, they may not find your Hornet and Enterprise, but they might. There's certainly enough aircraft that you could plausibly justify them doing so, or at least finding one of them. So that might mean that Midway goes from the Americans eventually destroying all 4 Japanese carriers and losing one of their own eventually, to perhaps the Americans still perhaps get the attack that gets rid of 3 Japanese carriers, the first one, although they might not, because Japanese recon efforts with more aircraft available might find them sooner, and the Japanese might, Nagumo might keep some of his carriers loaded for anti-shipping strike. You never know. But even so, they might kill Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, but then a counter-strike by 2 full Shokakus plus Hiryu might wipe out the Yorktown class, at which point you've traded 3 for 3, but the Japanese still have, Shokaku and Zuikaku once they come back online, plus these other 2 Shokakus plus Hiryu. So the Japanese have 4 big fleet carriers plus the smaller one in the terms of Hiryu, and the Americans at that point would just have, Saratoga and Wasp, and assuming Wasp goes up as she does historically, Saratoga, which puts them in a very bad place for the Guadalcanal campaign going forward. But then again, as with the historical Coral Sea, if the Americans know that the Japanese are showing up with 6 carriers instead of 4 at Midway, would the Americans send 3 carriers against 6? Again, possibly not. So, in theory, if you wanted to construct a timeline where the Americans do absolutely everything the same as they did historically with the minimum possible modifications, you could have the entire Yorktown class plus Lexington wiped out by the presence of these additional 2 Shokakus, which in turn also saves Hiryu, which in turn means that the Guadalcanal campaign, where Hiryu, Soryu, and Junyo, etc., and Rougeau all get bombed, and to varying degrees, obviously with 1 or 2 of them sunk, and the air groups get savaged. None of that happens, and if the Americans are still throwing ships at the problem, well, Saratoga on her own, in the face of potentially 4 Shokakus launching an airstrike at her, maybe doesn't survive. At which point you get to the end of 1942 and the US carrier fleet is theoretically down to Ranger in the Atlantic, and the Japanese have 4 Shokakus and Hiryu, plus Hio and Junyo and all the various light carrier conversions. And as good as Essex is, she's not good enough to take on all of that at once. And then, of course, the Japanese will get Taiho into service as well, which would mean the Americans would need at least until the end of 1943 to be coming up to matching the Japanese for numbers. And instead of bringing over HMS Victorious, even Admiral King might admit he might need to bring in more than that from the British to help try and bulk up the numbers. And even that's for the end of 1943. That's not going to help you really all that much in the early part of 1943. And of course, the lack of carrier air cover might have significant effects on the Guadalcanal campaign itself. Henderson Field will still be there, but can Henderson Field, shorn of reinforcement and cover from the American carrier forces, can it survive a mass air raid by 4 Shokakus? Probably not. But all of this assumes that the Americans just keep throwing ships at the situation as if those 2 Shokakus extra ones don't exist, which they wouldn't. So the entire course of the 1942 campaign would change dramatically. But to be fair, still the Americans would be on the back foot because they'd be outnumbered, and the Shokakus are not, bad carriers in the first place. They're the best the Japanese have. So, yeah, as for how long they can withstand the Essex swarm, well, in a worst case, Americans keep throwing everything at the wall scenario, you could end up with a roughly equal numbers replay of the situation in late 43, early 44, which delays the Pacific War by quite a bit. But, in reality, how the Americans would adapt to this, I don't know, but they probably aren't going to throw their entire carrier arm away for it, at which point the more carriers the Americans retain, the fewer numbers the Essex class have to make up, which then means that the Americans can afford to either refight Midway or go on the offensive earlier in 1943. So, it could delay the advance of the American fleet by a year and a half, or it could delay it by 6 to 8 months, or it could delay it by less than that. It really depends on what the American countermoves are. Salmon Cypher asks, when HMS Dreadnought was launched, she famously made pre-Dreadnoughts of the time obsolete basically overnight. But seeing as there was only one of her and it would take a while to replace a whole fleet, were there any plans to modernise some of the pre-Dreadnoughts? And if yes, what did this pre-Dreadnought modernisation look like, and how much could you squeeze out of one to make it as useful as possible in the Dreadnought world? Not in so much as a full overhaul refit of pre-Dreadnoughts, although such a thing did happen in the interwar period to things like Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein, which one of which you can see here. But at the time, you've got to remember that there's a dramatic and very significant change in the way naval battles are being fought. A few years before Dreadnought is laid down, you're still looking at fighting at extremely close range, 1,000, 1,500 yards. Then you have the invention of rangefinders, and in the early 1900s, with Sims and Percy Scott and so forth. So by the time Dreadnought is launched, and the Battle of Tsushima has kind of pointed out about barely a year before, ranges have increased somewhat significantly. But then as you get through the mid to late 1900s, you have the introduction of fire control tables, basically centralized fire control systems, direct to fire control as we would understand it. And so the ranges are increasing still further, which is further justifying the use of all big guns and less justifying secondary batteries. But it's that combination of rangefinders and fire control computers and all the ancillary relay equipment that makes that revolution possible. And the manufacture and installation of those technologies is something which has a very limited amount of throughput. So for the nations that were building dreadnoughts in various numbers, the production of the majority of those systems was being directed, understandably, into their brand new battleships and battle cruisers of the Dreadnought type, which were under construction and entering service. The modernization of older pre-Dreadnoughts was very much a secondary concern. Now, obviously, for some navies who weren't building many dreadnoughts and perhaps got into the dreadnought building game a little bit later, like, say, the Russians, improvising and adapting by installing more modern rangefinders and fire control systems and communications equipment onto their pre-dreadnoughts was perhaps more of a priority, because for them, they knew they were going to have to, long-term, have some of their better pre-dreadnoughts as part of their fleet alongside dreadnoughts, and so obviously those upgrades would take place. So you see things like the combined pre-dreadnought squadron that fights Goeben-Yavut Sultan Selim in the Black Sea. And you also have to take into account the way that various navies thought naval battles were still going to go. When you look at some of what you might call the semi-dreadnoughts, things like the Lord Nelsons or the Dantons, for example, the French Navy thought that battles were still going to take place at relatively close range compared to what other navies were thinking of by the end of the 1900s and the beginning of the 1910s. And at that stage, as long as they had rangefinders and so forth, the Dantons were still seen as reasonably viable. And indeed, there's an argument to be made that the Dantons, at maybe 8 to 10,000 yards or less, with their multiplicity of somewhat smaller guns, plus, of course, their big ones, could well have taken on some of the earlier dreadnoughts at that kind of close range, because their big guns might, with the secondary battery, would be big enough to have some effect and rapid fire enough to potentially overwhelm a dreadnought that maybe had an 8-gun broadside. But for the larger navies, there was an understanding that, of course, they were going to be building quite a few dreadnoughts, and that would be the core of their fleet. And if you were to take your very latest pre-dreadnoughts, so in the British case, the Lord Nelsons, the Connecticuts for the Americans, the Deutschlands for the Germans, the Dantons for the French, etc., etc., if you were to take them and take them offline for a few years to refit them into some kind of updated form that would make them somewhat useful against dreadnoughts, well, you'd be taking a good chunk of what was actually your frontline battle fleet offline, and by the time you returned it to service, you should in theory have enough dreadnoughts in service that even in their refitted form they wouldn't be particularly useful. So whilst small updates were done to keep the biggest and best of the pre-dreadnoughts in service, at least for the larger navies who were looking at building full-size dreadnought fleets, they weren't looking at full-scale overhauls and modernisations. Although I said some of the smaller navies and the ones who were a bit more delayed did do a little bit more work. And of course the Germans in the interwar period had to do a lot of work. For the next question, I'm going to pass down what was a fairly honestly rude and irritating attempt to theoretically ask a question, but also just insult me generally. Essentially asking, why do you get the pronunciation of various names wrong? Except the original question also had the implication of, the fact I apparently don't know how to speak, and I was deliberately being insulting to various people and places and so on and so forth. So anyway, the gist of it is, why do I get some pronunciations wrong? Well, there's a variety of different reasons. Some is very simple. Some pronunciations are just very, very difficult for me, and I try and do the best that I can, and I don't hold it against other people if they have similar problems but with different names. So for me, as someone brought up in the UK, the name Indefatigable, as per this aircraft carrier here, is really easy. However, I've heard a lot of Americans struggle to pronounce that. But, unlike the person who originated this question, I don't hold it against them. They're doing their best. Linguistics. Who knew? At other times, it can be because, well, at least back when I was in school, I think they do things slightly differently now, and not necessarily for the best, I was taught how to pronounce English words, or words written in Roman letters, by following the phonetic sounds. So you try and break it down into blocks, and that's why for a very long time I pronounced a certain Japanese port as Yokosuka, because Yokosuka, Yokosuka, is how it is written in English. The fact that it is apparently Yokosuka is something that I'd only really be familiar with if I talked extensively to someone who spoke English who happened to have spent time there, or I was actually in the port itself. Because if you just look at it on paper, to an English-speaking person, it just says Yokosuka. And those kind of situations are always slightly bizarre to me, because I may have mentioned this in a previous Drydock. If the pronunciation of a given place sounds a certain way in English, like apparently Yokosuka, then especially, to a certain extent, obviously you've got, languages that share a common character set, in French, Italian, German, English, Spanish, etc., is one thing. But when you've got somebody who's using kanji or the Cyrillic alphabet or some other form of alphabet that is completely different to what you use in English, if you are transliterating the name into English, you are not bound to keeping characters exactly the same. So for example, with Spanish, you might have Spanish port, well, two Spanish ports, for example. They're spelt a certain way in Spanish. It uses Roman letters, the same as we use in English. Therefore, the name just gets copied over straight. So someone who looks at it in English would say, oh, that's Cartagena, I've heard it pronounced by some people, and Cadiz, or, whereas in Spanish it's Cartagena and Cadiz. That kind of mispronunciation is a little bit understandable because it's spelt that's exactly the same in both cases. It's just, the culture that originates it pronounces it one way, whereas phonetically in English it would sound another way. But the spelling uses the same characters, so it's understandable why that confusion takes place. Whereas with Yokosuka, you're translating it from kanji, so why not actually spell it in a way that it would be phonetically pronounced as Yokosuka? I don't know. I wasn't the one in charge of transliterating it, but that can lead to confusion at times because, of course, as I say, if I've only read a name, I'm going to try and pronounce it the way I was taught to pronounce names written in English characters. Of course, there is a little bit of a grey zone when you get to things like, Polish or Hungarian, a lot of Eastern European languages, and where it may be spelt using Roman characters, but the way the words are formed is so obviously anathema to standard English pronunciation that you realise there is going to be something very, very different about how you pronounce this, and then you really have to go looking. And then you get to things that have different pronunciations in different, not even necessarily different languages, but just in different regions. And if you're in the UK, you'll know exactly what I mean. In the US, at least you have the good grace to have to travel several hundred miles before people start speaking differently. In the UK, it can be a 10-minute walk before people are barely intelligible in some cases. And so, with the video that this originated with, the Albany one, or Albany one, I suppose, the fact is, the exact spelling, Albany, that is the name of several places in the UK. And it's, derivative of other places, like we have St Albans in the UK. And most of the places in the UK are also pronounced Albany, with, slight regional twangs to it. There is, of course, Albany in the US, which is also pronounced Albany. And then there's the one in Australia, which is pronounced Albany, for whatever reason. But as an English-speaking person, as in a UK English-speaking person, I see the word, and some part of my memory might go, oh yes, but in Australia they pronounce it a certain way. But my default, I've grown up with that word. I know what that word sounds like because it's native to my area, to my country, so I'm going to see it and go, oh, that's Albany. And automatically that's going to fill in. And yes, okay, I should perhaps make a little bit more of an effort where there's exactly the same word pronounced slightly differently by another nation that also ostensibly speaks English, but hopefully it's somewhat understandable when I'm in the flow of reading off a script that I've written, and I'm just going to automatically fill in what my brain tells me this is how it should be pronounced. Plus, again, perhaps growing up in the UK, I have somewhat less sensitivity towards the finer details of how exactly things are being pronounced, because, as I said, we have so many regional dialects within such a compact country that if you were going to get offended at the exact way that somebody pronounces something, you'd be getting into fights every 5 minutes. Most of the time, apart from a few people who are very pernickety and generally looked down upon by everyone else as a little bit dim, in the UK, as long as it's vaguely understandable what you're talking about, people will just accept it and roll with it of, oh yeah, he's a southerner, he pronounces it this way. He's a Mancunian, he pronounces it this way. He's from Newcastle, so he's a Geordie, he'll pronounce it a different way. But we all know what we're talking about, so can we please all just get along? Unless you're in Glasgow, in which case a fight is mandatory. And then related, but not entirely the same as that, is places or ships or names of various descriptions which don't have any particular relation to the UK, so I can't claim, this is how I've grown up hearing it, but do have multiple potential pronunciations elsewhere, and I know one of them and not the other. So, for example, the US fleet submarines, the main fleet submarine class of World War II. Now, they're named after a fish, and the fish name is a Spanish name, gato, cat. You can guess from that what kind of fish is being referred to. And indeed, if you look up, pez gato and, all the derivatives thereof, you'll see that when it comes to the fish itself, it's gato. But I got some stick at times from American viewers for calling them the Gato class submarines. And obviously being half Bolivian, I also know Gato. that's part of my linguistic inheritance from my mum. But apparently in America, it's pronounced Gato. Again, for whatever linguistic reason. And the funny thing was that occasionally in some videos, I would pronounce it Gato, and then I'd get pushback from other people, also in America, who would tell me, actually, it's Gato. And so you have, two sets of people, both ostensibly from the same country, the US, which originates this class of fleet sub. Half of them are telling me it's Gato, half of them are telling me it's Gato. You can't please everybody at that point. Eventually, I came down on the side of Gato, pretty much because somebody helpfully linked me to a video of a US Navy official who was giving a briefing of some sort during World War II, and he referred to them as the Gato class submarines, at which point I was like, yep, okay, you know what, if the US Navy at the time was calling them the Gato class, we might as well call them the Gato class, whatever. So yeah, there's a whole range of reasons why I might pronounce a name that, to the ears of a local to that area, nation, ship, whatever, might not sound quite right, or might sound horribly wrong. But as I've just spent the last 10 minutes explaining, there's a variety of reasons for that. None of them are to do with malice, or lack of will. It's just a fact of life. I am human, my vocal cords only work so many ways, and there's a bunch of imprinted information as to how things should be pronounced in my head. And in some cases, not all, but a reasonable amount, even the locals can't necessarily agree on how to pronounce the name of a given place, ship, location, etc. I mean, just look at the occasional running gag that is how to pronounce the American state of Nevada. Joe's Voboda asks, is that a submarine amongst all the transports at the 23:55-minute mark of the Albany video, directly astern of the ship that's slightly right of centre at that point? Well, yep, you've got some eagle eyes on you. Yes, indeed, that is a submarine. This photo is part of the panoramic of the second ANZAC convoy, and that is HMAS AE2, the second of Australia's submarines. And the ship that it's directly behind is the Berrima, which is the vessel that would actually tow AE2 across the Indian Ocean. So very well spotted there. PH89787 asks, hypothetically, regardless of any casualties suffered by the Eastern Fleet, how would the Imperial Japanese Navy go forward with the battles of Coral Sea and Midway if they only have carrier divisions 1 and 5 making up the Kido Butai? So, for reference, obviously, that would be Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, and Suikaku, given that Hiryu and Soryu Carrier Division 2 would have been the ones that would have been sunk. It's a little bit of an interesting one, actually, because in theory, nothing really affects the ability of the Japanese to deploy the forces that they did to the Battle of Coral Sea, because, of course, that was Shokaku, Suikaku, and Shoho, none of which are affected by the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. So the Battle of the Coral Sea could go pretty much the way that it historically did. Of course, Nagumo is relatively unlikely to still be in command of the Kido Butai, having lost 1/3 of its strength to a ragtag bunch of British ships in the middle of the night in the Indian Ocean. So whoever succeeds him might have slightly different plans of how to do things, and I rather suspect that the force composition might be a little bit different, because I suspect the Japanese will probably become exceptionally paranoid about providing heavy, close-in surface escort for their carriers all of a sudden. But broadly speaking, the Japanese, if they want to, would still be able to carry out the Coral Sea mission without all that much changing. Midway, on the other hand, is a bit more of a difficult one, because, of course, historically, assuming that they go with Coral Sea, as they originally did, Midway is going to have them down Shokaku and Suikaku because of the damage to air groups and ships taken at Coral Sea, and they are now also short Hiryu and Soryu because they're at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, which leaves them with just Akagi and Kaga, plus, at that point they might have to pull things like Rujo out of the woodwork. I don't think with just Akagi and Kaga as their fleet carriers they would actually go for it. And you might argue that circumstances at that point might force them to send out one of the Shokakus by doing the whole blend the air group of one with the ship of the other thing that they were very historically against. But I suspect that even with 3 carriers, they know that the Americans can potentially oppose them with 2 or 3 carriers, and no one likes a fair fight. So I think you'd have one of two scenarios. Either Yamamoto would not go with the northern attack and thus bring those ships down to reinforce the Midway operation. So you just have the one operation. And or he might decide to delay the Midway operation until expedited repairs and reinforcement of the carrier division that's made up of the two Shokakus could be done. So at that point, Midway might happen a few months later than it does historically, and the balance will be Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and possibly one or more of the lighter Japanese carriers instead. Of course, that potentially, depending on how far along it's delayed, allows the Americans to bring Saratoga into the mix as well, and to a fully repaired Yorktown. So it presents an interesting hypothetical alternative to Midway. And the flip side, of course, is that, again, if the Japanese are now being hyper-paranoid about having surface escorts close into their carriers, instead of having the battleships and a lot of the cruisers sitting further back with the invasion force, you may have Yamato and various other ships all bunched up with the Japanese carriers, at which point potential dilution of American attack efforts may take place. It depends how strongly American dive bombers and torpedo bombers that show up stick to going after the carriers, and can they resist if they see the giant shape of Yamato going for that instead. Of course, the flip side to the flip side to the flip side of all of that is that, the Devastators might well have been replaced by Avengers, so they might have a slightly higher survival rate. Rob Smith asks, inert shells, by design, not by accident. How deep into each of the major types of aircraft carrier would an inert 16-inch shell penetrate, assuming it doesn't hit anything too solid on the way down? Unfortunately, it's not a question to which you could provide particularly specific answers, certainly in a 5-minute Drydock question, possibly not even in a Wednesday video, because for each carrier, it's going to depend on where the shell hits, and then obviously for each different type of carrier, the shells hitting in the same location on different carriers may come up with different results as well. So assuming we're talking about an inert shell, a completely inert shell, so a classic armor-piercing solid shot round, like it's back in the 1870s or something, and there's no fuse to set off, no explosives aboard, etc. If you take, for example, an illustrious class aircraft carrier, like you see here, then obviously a shell that hits the flight deck or the armoured sides of the hangar or the belt, that is going to go a considerably lesser distance down into the ship than if, say, you have a Yorktown or an Essex class and the shell hits the side of the hangar. So, taking that into consideration, I mean, the amount of armour that we're talking about versus a 16-inch shell, presumably fired at a reasonable range, it's probably going to go straight through and out the other side, regardless of whether it's an illustrious or an Essex class, regardless of the fact that the illustrious class has an armoured hangar, simply because of the amount of energy involved. Again, assuming there's no fuse or explosive to go off. But if you had a 16-inch shell, say, go through the side of an illustrious class's hangar, by the time it exits the other side of the hangar and continues off into the sea, it will be going considerably slower than if it went through a Essex class's hangar or a Yorktown's hangar. And likewise, going through the deck, it's going to be considerably slower by the time it reaches the hangar deck going through an illustrious class's deck than it would be going through an Essex or a Yorktown's deck, or any number of other carriers like a Akagi or Kaga. Then, of course, if the shell hits an unarmoured portion of the hull, it's going to go quite a way through, again, quite possibly being inert. If it hits an unarmoured portion of the hull with a reasonable angle, it could either go through and through, or it could go all the way down, assuming, as you said, it doesn't hit anything major like an engine or boiler or something. Whereas if it hits the belt armour of a ship, then, well, it some carriers didn't have any belt armor, some had very minimal splinter-proof belt, some had armor belts that were proof against 6-inch, some had armor belts that were proof against 8-inch gunfire. So how far the shell would go would depend on what angle is it striking, not just in terms of angle of fall, but also incident angle. Is it striking, say, like with this photo, is the shell traveling with the camera in this case and thus striking an illustrious class's armor belt at quite a significant off angle, or is it hitting perpendicular? You've got the Lexingtons, which have perhaps more armor. With the Lexingtons, you could even hit the 8-inch turrets, etc. I mean, with most carriers, assuming you're not going fore to aft, there is a reasonable chance of a completely inert 16-inch shell that doesn't hit something very solid, like you say in your question, of just going straight through and out the other side of most aircraft carriers. But the velocity at which it does so is going to depend very strongly on what armor, if any, and how thick armor it contacts on its way through and what angle it does so at. And ultimately, if it hits fairly low, so for example, it hits on the waterline of a carrier that has quite a bit of belt armor for a carrier, and then plows through multiple storage compartments and potentially magazine sides, etc., there's a reasonable chance that that shell may actually lose enough velocity to fetch up inside the hull of the carrier. But, working out exactly how far and which hit locations for every single carrier is quite a bit of work. I don't envy the person who has to do that. Vokir asks, the steamboat Arabia, having sunk in the Missouri River in 1856, found itself buried in 30 feet of silt after the river changed course, roughly a mile from the river's current location. Some careful detective work and some educated guesses allowed an archaeological team to find the ship's burial site and excavate it in 1988, finding the ship remarkably intact and preserved, and allowing much of the ship to be preserved in a local museum. Do you think there are any riverine warships from this period who could be found using similar methods, and are there any examples? Riverine warships from the 19th century, I don't know. Riverine stuff in general is one of the weaker spots of my area of knowledge. However, I suspect there are probably a good number of riverine warships out there buried in what is now the land, scattered over a fairly wide period of time, because I think, especially with a river that in some places at least changes course fairly frequently, like say the Nile Delta, there's probably, if they haven't rotted away completely, remains of Egyptian and Sea People's warships, because if there's one thing you can guarantee about the Nile Delta, it's that the arms of the Nile Delta that the Sea Peoples fought Ramses III on are probably non-existent today, and any ships that sank in that battle are probably somewhere under somebody's field. And similarly with some other rivers. The thing is, certain rivers are known for changing course quite often, like at least the Delta part of the Nile. Other rivers have been known to stick to pretty much the same course for hundreds, if not thousands of years, or near enough. I also suspect that perhaps where there's been gradual human encroachment, like, say, on the River Thames, there's probably a good number of ships buried under things like embankment and so forth, where just natural growth, and perhaps even using those ships as hulks at the time when they were expanding the riverbank, may have occurred. And there'll be some areas where ports have been abandoned and silted up, which are technically on rivers. So I think one of Rome's major harbours, actual Rome harbour, as well as Carthage or Caesarea Maritima, there's probably ships buried under there. I mean, some of those are obviously seaports, so you're playing fast and loose a bit perhaps with the definition of river. But as I say, riverine warfare in general is not necessarily my strong suit outside of some very particular campaigns. So again, I would appeal to you listeners, if any of you happen to know of riverine warships that have been excavated in what is now land, or are suspected to be under portions of land because the river has shifted course, please let us know in the comments below, because I'd be as interested as anyone else is in finding out about them. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, concerning Royal Navy battleship guns, was there any way to prevent the reset of gun sizes from the 413mm main battery of the Victoria class to the relatively common pre-Dreadnought and early Dreadnought 305mm main batteries? In other words, was there any way the Royal Navy could have launched HMS Dreadnought in 1906 with a 413mm, that's 16.25-inch, main battery without a marked drop in overall performance? Theoretically, yes, but practically no. So by the time this video releases, what will be the upcoming video in a week and a half or so, when you look at the construction of naval guns, you'll see some of the issues surrounding the whole thing. But the fact was that the reason the Royal Navy went from 16.25-inch to 12-inch as a common caliber for its battleships was that the advances in metallurgy and propellant that occurred around that time allowed you to get longer range and more accurate 12-inch guns that had as good or better armour penetration as compared to the shorter barrel 16.25-inch weapons. And those guns were lighter. They were just under half the weight, even with the additional length, compared to the 16.25s, which meant the Royal Navy could go back to having 4 main guns on its ships in obviously the classic pre-Dreadnought layout, and 4 guns was really, as for main battery guns, was really what the Royal Navy preferred for all sorts of reasons, including the salvo accuracy issues that I've mentioned in previous Drydocks. And then you've got the fact that, of course, when people are designing battleships of the time, they're trying to design ships that can reasonably have a decent chance of penetrating the enemy ship's belt armour, and possibly, if they're thinking a little bit further ahead, the next generation of ships that are under planning or construction at the time. And for that, the 12-inch 35, the 12-inch 40, and later the 12-inch 45 were perfectly adequate weapons. To go with a new metallurgy, new propellant 16.25-inch weapon, with obviously a much longer barrel, potentially, maybe with a bit of investment, British gun-making technology could have been made to be able to produce such a weapon. A little bit questionable early on, but maybe they could have stuck with a 12-inch for a short while and then reverted if they'd really, pulled their finger out. But the problem at that point would have been you would have had a colossally powerful weapon for the time, which is just absolutely massive overkill in terms of punching through the sides of enemy ships. It would weigh a huge amount and would then basically either restrict you to having a ship with a single twin turret up front, like Sansparai, which you can see here, which, as I mentioned before, a distant relative of mine actually commanded at one point, or you would have to have much larger, much heavier, much more expensive ships to mount 4 such guns. So, by 1906, if they'd been pressing for this solution ever since the launch of Victoria and Sansparai and then the advancements in propellant and metallurgy, in theory, yes, you could launch HMS Dreadnought in 1906, I think, with 10 16.25-inch long-barrel guns, but that ship would be massively larger than Dreadnought, and apart from obviously having probably sparked an absolutely ridiculous naval arms race that would have been really pushing the metallurgical capabilities of all nations at the time, it would be a completely unnecessarily over-armed vessel, and there would be lots of arguments of saying, well, why don't we just have a smaller ship with smaller guns that can still penetrate everybody's armour, or for the same size of ship, more smaller guns, so we've got a greater chance of hitting with more shells. Jim Smitty asks, I'm still on a kick of asking questions from reading Hornfisher's works, this time from Fleet at Flood Tide. In Chapter 11, he talks about Jocko Clark, who was attacking the Bonins prior to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. When the orders came to return to the fleet, he wanted to disregard those orders to roam and get into the rear of the Japanese fleet and strike it. However, Admiral Harrell wanted no part of this plan and essentially dragged Clark back south. Clark believed that he had given up a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and he missed his chance to be the Beatty of the war. This had me go, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. What were American opinions of Beatty during World War II? As from what I've seen, no one in their right mind should want to be the Beatty of the war. What am I missing? Jocko Clark's a good officer, but wanting to be Beatty is not something I expected. What is the context I'm missing here? I think there's two elements to this. Firstly is that obviously from the US Navy perspective, therefore a little bit of an outside perspective compared to the Royal Navy or Britain as a whole, Beatty, at least at the time, could have been seen as, the guy who charges into the enemy and fights them up close and personal. And let's face it, for better or worse, usually worse, Beatty had led the British fleet in World War I into the most number of major enemy contacts between, Dogger Bank, Heligoland Bight, Jutland, etc., etc. So, from a perspective of I want to be the guy who leads a rampaging high-speed attack on the enemy, from an outside perspective, if that's all you really take away of Beatty's World War I career, then the statement makes sense to a degree. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that whilst these days, with the benefit of hindsight and a lot of stuff that's been revealed subsequently, it is perhaps a little bit easier for us to come down rather definitively on the side of Beatty might have been a good administrator and a good higher up, but not really a good admiral to be in charge of a fleet or a independent command of any real significant description in an actual war. Back then, the 1940s, the catfight between Beatty supporters and Jellicoe supporters was still very much ongoing. Both admirals were only relatively recently dead, and of course Beatty had used the interwar years and his position as First Sea Lord in a portion of that time to really try and enforce his version of events on everybody. So, obviously being a naval officer, Admiral Clark is more likely to be perhaps more interested in the goings-on of Admiral Beatty versus Admiral Jellicoe and so forth, rather than perhaps the average American civilian. But even if that is the case, then there was a fair amount of pro-Beatty propaganda around at the time. And again, as an external observer, even one with a certain amount of naval expertise, it's entirely possible that if his exposure to Beatty's reputation in, say, the immediate pre-war period had been from Beatty loyalists, then he may well have bought into Beatty's version of Jutland, etc., which would have obviously painted Beatty in a more favourable light, which would explain his desire, that being Clark's, to be more like Beatty, rather than, these days where, with better evidence, I think he probably would not express such an opinion. The French Taunter asks, were any torpedoes in the interwar period designed or modified to specifically defeat any of the torpedo protection schemes being developed? Or was the counter to this protection just more powerful torpedoes and underkeel magnetic detonation, which was inconsistent at best, at least early on in the war? Well, slightly before the interwar period, you do, of course, have things like the Davis torpedo, which, as you can see here, was designed to deliver an 8-inch shell to the side of a ship underwater, which, if it had been made to work, theoretically actually would have done a reasonably decent job, because, of course, torpedo defense systems in the interwar period consisted either of just bulges, or in the case of more newly built ships, the void system. But an 8-inch shell that managed to get up to an appreciable speed after being delivered, to the exterior of a target, given that none of those intervening layers would have been particularly armoured. You might have had a torpedo bulkhead with a minimal amount of armour, but you're essentially talking about a perpendicular point-blank shot. That might have actually worked. It would have punched a relatively small hole in the ship as compared to, a torpedo warhead detonating and blowing a 10-foot by 20-foot hole in it. But a hole all the way through the torpedo defences is still a hole they're going to need to deal with. And of course, at the far end where the crew are, there would have been a shell explosion, which wouldn't have really helped matters all that much. But in the interwar period, specifically, as far as I am aware, then, yeah, pretty much the two counters that were involved were either stick more explosive in the torpedo warhead, because a given defense system was rated to defend against a torpedo warhead of up to a certain size. So logically, if you could get a torpedo that, would just carry more explosive, it could defeat all of those systems. It was a fairly simple solution, even if it did require either more powerful explosives or a bigger torpedo to handle the more powerful and more explosives. The main thing, though, was the underkeel magnetic detonation feature, because, of course, that would allow you to bypass the defensive systems, which is the best way of defeating them. Just detonate where they aren't, because completely surrounding a ship all the way on the underside, across the keel and back up the other side with a multi-layer torpedo defense system, in theory, I suppose you could do it, but it's thoroughly impractical in reality. There were a few ideas batted around that you could perhaps put a delayed action fuse on the torpedo, because, let's face it, if the torpedo's moving at 30-40 knots and it smashes into some relatively thin plating with the weight that a torpedo has, chances are, if you put, even the most minimal of armor-piercing caps on the front, it could smash certainly through the outer hull plating, and then maybe through at least one further layer, and then you could have the warhead explode. There is some discussion that is known to have occurred in that regard on paper, but it was never put into practice, because very quickly they ran the numbers and realized that, well, the sheer force of the collision and the energies involved and how violent it was, especially with the way torpedoes are built and structured for neutral buoyancy, etc., you'd very quickly run into the problem, much as they found with some of the Mark 14 experiments, that unless you had a warhead detonator that acted really quickly, the forces of deceleration and then the crushing force of impact could very quickly destroy any detonator, which would obviously then make it a dud, which wasn't particularly useful. And if you set the fuse and the warhead back far enough that the sort of mostly inert front portion of the torpedo could do some penetration work, and then in theory you could set off a kind of a mid-body warhead or something like that, well, chances are at that point the actual point where the warhead exploded would probably be much closer to the outside of the ship anyway, at which point you'd gone through an awful lot of problems for not a huge amount of result, because the effect is going to be essentially the same, except for maybe you drive the armor-piercing cap forward through the ship a little bit, but a lot of complication and perhaps restriction on the fuel reserves of the torpedo and thus shorter range for not a hugely better result. And rounding us off for this week, Patrick Donnelly asks, which ship or naval operation in the period covered by the channel looks like it was thought up, designed and built or implemented by Jeremy Clarkson, James May and Richard Hammond? Well, there's a lot of candidates. The ships and navies of this period were certainly not short on a few mad ideas, but the two that immediately sprang to mind from my many years of watching Top Gear and later the Grand Tour would probably be either the catapult armoured merchantman, as seen here, or the Lord Clive monitors, the ones that were retrofitted with Furious's 18-inch guns. I mean, you can just see the discussion in one of the little build montages for something like a catapult armed merchantman, can't you? Because, you'd have James May saying, "Look, chaps, we've got this problem. The Germans are coming over with these big airplanes and scouting us," and then Hammond going, "Well, surely we need an aircraft carrier," and then Clarkson going, "Ah, yes, Hammond, but we don't have any aircraft carriers, but I have a plan." And then the other two going, "Oh no." It's like, "Yes, we shall take this bit of old scaffolding and we're going to stick it on the front of a merchantman, and then we're going to take this old fighter that I found in my back garden," and Hammond kind of shaking his head and May going, "Scaffolding and fighters, well, how's it going to take the air?" It's like, well, you see, I have found a rocket." And then Hammond going, "A rocket? Yes, a rocket. And I'm going to strap this rocket to the fighter to get it to go really fast in a short distance, and then it can take off and shoot down the German. And the other two kind of staring at him for a while and then going, I think probably May would be going, and how's it going to land again? And then Clarkson kind of going, oh yeah. Well, I hadn't thought that far ahead. I suppose he'll just have to ditch into the ocean and we'll get somebody to pick him up. And then Hammond going, the freezing cold North Atlantic? Yes, well, we'll put him in some warm clothes and give him a life belt. I can totally imagine that occurring. And then the other one, of course, say the Lord Clive class monitors is like, we decided to make the torpedoes explode somewhere over there by fitting giant bulges. Then a bunch of inappropriate innuendos and jokes about the size of the bulges and the way the ship looks underwater. And then, they show up expecting a standard Lord Clive class monitor. And then probably James are going, Clarkson! What? This ship is supposed to have a movable gun turret. Yes, but I thought it was too small. What do you mean too small? They're ex-battleship gun turrets. Yes, but this one is bigger. It doesn't move. That's all right. We can just move the ship to aim at our targets. And if it can't move, how are you going to get the shells to the gun? Ah, well, you see, my genius knows no bounds. I have invented the shipborne railway. And then May about to have an apoplectic meltdown, and then Hammond going, no, I think he's got a point. This is really fun. And then Hammond just cruises past the camera riding on a miniature railway towing an 18-inch shell. Either one of those classic Top Gear - Grand Tour build projects. Feel free to suggest your own below as well. And that wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Until then, bye for now.